Hey everyone, new video. This one's going to be about Greek philosophy and science. Okay, look at it. All right, now, and this actually picks up kind of where we left off from class when we talked about the end of the Peloponnesian War and how Athens lost the war, and it kind of led to a crisis. And we talked about philosophy already this year, and if you recall, we mentioned that philosophers come along in a crisis. When there's something wrong, something that needs to be fixed, the philosophers come and say, here's how we fix this. No one listens to the philosopher if things are great. Only when things are bad do people listen to philosophers. And so this is that point in time in Western civilization, specifically in the city of Athens, where that crisis occurred. Athenians had lost the Peloponnesian War. They had been stripped of their army and navy by the Spartans. They were asking the question, why? Why did we lose this war? What happened to us? Where were the gods? All those big questions, right? But these real questions, the questions about how to fix us, actually blossom into bigger questions about truth and beauty and justice and the ideal world. And we're going to get that from these Greek philosophers that really have become household names. And even if people don't know what they did, they do recognize the name. So let's talk about the philosophers and how they got started and why everybody knows who they are. So we start with Socrates, right? And these just bullet points here to get us started. Socrates, the founder of Western philosophy, is considered the founder of Western philosophy, the first moral philosopher. I'll explain what that means. He was critical of Athenian society, and he became very popular among the young people. Now, here's what we need to understand about Socrates. Imagine that you're walking down the street in our town, and you see this homeless guy, poor guy, and he's talking, to no one, just on the street, just talking. And you kind of sort of listen, but you're not listening. And all of a sudden he starts to say things that make a lot of sense. And so you start to listen to this guy. And he looks ugly and he hasn't showered or shaved, but he actually started making sense. And so you start following him around and he starts pointing out things about life and the world and what's wrong with it and how it could be better. And this was Socrates. Socrates, as said by the Greek historians, was an ugly man with bug eyes and big nose, and his head was too big for his body, and so he was old, and he didn't bathe very much, and he had a home, but he didn't like his wife, so he didn't stay there very often, and so he would just walk around the city, and everybody kind of knew him as Crazy Socrates, and he would just bring up different points of here and there, and why is this thus, and what is the point of this thusness, and so people started listening to him, and he started to make sense. He would criticize government, what's wrong with government. He criticized a lot of things. There are plenty of stories about Socrates and the stuff that he would do. One, just to give you an example, he walks into a market, right, and there are two people arguing in this market. He's like, what's going on? Why are we arguing? And one guy says, I'm a potter, and I've been here for 5 years, and I've worked here, and I worked real hard for my living, and this guy over here, he moved in 3 months ago, and he's taken my business, and I want him gone because I was here first. And so Socrates says, okay, let me get this straight. You're mad at this guy because he opened up a shop near yours. Yes, he did. That's exactly why I'm mad. Well, do you say, like in the last 3 months, you've had to work harder? Oh, yes, I've had to work very hard to keep up with this guy. Do you say that maybe you had to make better pots since he's moved in? Yes, I've had to do that. Well, do you say that he's actually made you a better potter then? And the guy's like, yeah, I guess that he has. So then why are you mad at him? And that was Socrates. Right? Socrates, that's his whole point. Is I'm going to ask you questions and questions until you answer your own question. And that's what he did. And the young people loved it. They just followed him around and thought it was great, right? And so, but Socrates, like, the Buddha and like Jesus that we will study, never wrote anything down, never had a classroom, never officially stood in front of people and taught them. He just walked around saying things, and people, followed him and thought he was pretty wise. And he became very popular during his lifetime. He'd be invited to dinners with the wealthiest people because they just wanted to hear him talk and wanted to wonder what he would say, right? And so he kind of made a reputation like that. But here's the problem. You have Socrates in the middle of the Peloponnesian War walking around town criticizing things, right? Then they lose the Peloponnesian War, and they want to blame someone. So the government comes along and says, Socrates criticizes us all the time. He's stirring up bad feelings and non-patriotic feelings, right, against Athens. And so they arrest Socrates for criticizing the government, right? And so they put him on trial. And they say, okay, Socrates, we know you, and we know that you like to do your thing, and it's very popular, especially with the young people, but we need you to stop. because you're starting to create problems with our society. And Socrates is like, look, here's what I am. I'm a fly, and you're a massive fat horse that won't move, right? That's your problem. And I'm the fly that bites you to get you to move. And I am doing you a service by biting you so you can move and not be fat and lazy. They're like, that's hilarious, Socrates, but we really need you to stop. If you don't stop, then we're going to have to, like, put you on trial and maybe sentence you to death. And Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. And so the government said, we can help you with that. And so they executed him. They made him drink poison hemlock, right? And so charged with corrupting the Athenian youth, he was sentenced to death and then executed. Man, if that was a law here, they would have put me under the jail. Okay, so Socrates. Now, Socrates' legend lives on. And in fact, shortly after his death, he's given somewhat of a hero status. And his students, his loyal followers, really kind of make a educational career off of knowing Socrates and writing down and then teaching his thoughts to other people. So Socrates was the first great philosopher. One of his students, this is the death of Socrates. Now this painting, we're going to look at this artist when we get to the French Revolution. What does the French Revolution have to do with ancient Greece? Well, this artist here, Jacques-Louis David, is going to paint this, and it's going to have a lot of symbolic meaning for the French before their revolution occurs in the 18th century, right? So here he is. The unexamined life is not worth living. And so the story is that he has the hemlock, and that was his punishment. He had to drink poison. The poison was from the hemlock plant. And he drank it, and he just kind of sort of taught and talked and lectured until he died. And everybody's very sad, as you can see, right? So the most famous of Socrates' students is a guy named Plato, right? Not the stuff that you play with in kindergarten. Plato, that's Play-Doh, all right? Keep up. Now, he was a student of Socrates, and he's not going to just wander around the city saying things. He actually establishes a school that they're going to call the Academy in Athens. So imagine this. I know it's hard. People show up to this school because they want to go, and they sit and listen to lectures from Plato and other students of Socrates, and they learn things because they want to learn things, and they go off and express that. I know it's crazy. I'm glad you're sitting down for this, but that's what happened. Now, Plato, a lot of times, it seemed like his mission in life was to explain and put forth the ideas of Socrates for the world. And so in many of the works that he wrote, and many of the things he did, he taught and wrote in the voice of Socrates. And so it's like, I'm going to tell you a story about Socrates. Here's what Socrates does. But really what he's doing is he's marrying his philosophy with the philosophy of his teacher, and then together writing them and publishing them to the world. Now, his most famous work that we see and influences Western thought is his work on the Republic, where he develops a theory called the theory of forms. Okay, so hold on. Take a look at this wooden chair. All right, now if we were in a class, I would say, hey, is this chair real? And what you would say to yourself is, he's trying to trick me. This is a trick question. Obviously, the chair is real, but he wants me to say it's real because it's not real for some reason that I don't understand. And that's fine. Now, so just fall for it and say it's real. Yes, it's a real chair. Fantastic. Why is it real? Well, because I can pick it up. It has weight. I can sit in it if I want to. It's made of wood. It's really hard. It's a physical chair in a real world. Plato would say this. Okay, let's say, for example, you're a chair maker, right? And you make this chair. You have a vision of this chair in your mind. So you go back to your wooden shop and you cut all the wood together. You sand it down, you polish it, you put it all together, and you make this chair. It's the same chair that's in your head, and you've made it, right? So you leave it in your shop, you lock up the shop that night, but here's what happens. There's a fire, and the fire burns down your shop, and the chair is gone. But the chair still exists. Where does the chair exist? In your mind, right? And so that's Plato. Plato says no. The chair is not real because it's merely a copy of the chair that actually exists in your head. So the only real things are things in your head, things that don't change, right? The chair can be burned, the chair can get old and fall apart, the chair can lay out in the rain and rot, but the chair in your brain will always be there. It's always the same. So the only things we can rely on are things in our brain, things that do not change. Okay, so stay with me here. One way he demonstrated this in his book, The Republic, was the parable of the cave. Okay, so this is the Republic, parable of the cave. In the Republic, what he does in the voice of Socrates is he explains the perfect society, or what we call a utopia, right? what is the perfect society and how does the perfect society work. Now, in this perfect society, he divides everyone into class by skill or intellect, right? If you're good with your hands, you're going to be a worker. If you're strong and brave, then you're going to be a soldier. If you are good at growing things, you'll be a farmer. And of course, the most intellectual and smartest of them would be the rulers, which would be the philosophers. That's convenient, right? The philosopher is the king. Thanks, Plato. All right, now, here we are, the parable of the cave. Now, take a look at this, and again, I've put the PowerPoint online, so if you need to look at the PowerPoint, that's fine, right? So, here's the story that Plato told to explain his theory of forms. You are a prisoner in a cave, and you have lived in that cave since your earliest memory, since you were a child. And you are chained, like these people, against this wall, and all you can see is the wall in front of you because you're chained. You're stuck, right? Why can't I move my head? Relax, it's just a story, okay? You're stuck, and you're looking at the wall. Behind you is a fire, just like you see here. And the only things that you see and have seen all your life are the shadows of things that pass between the fire and the wall. Like we see here, these weird people in monk habits are walking across here, and the shadows of their things are on the wall. So that is your reality. Your reality are the shadows. And that's all you know, and so that's real, right? But one day, you break your chains, and you're able to escape out of the cave, and you're able to see the real world. You see the sun, the grass, the trees, everything, and you're like, oh, wow, this is reality. So your reality has shifted. You thought the shadows were real, but they weren't. Now the world is real. So you come back to the cave, and you tell your friends, you got to come with me and see this stuff. This isn't real. That's real. Are they happy to see you? Are they happy to hear your story? And the answer is no. The answer is they're afraid and angry at you for trying to change their reality, right? And so they would kill you if they could break free of their chains because you have threatened them and threatened their reality. And what that teaches us is those philosophers who see the world in a different way sometimes live a very lonely existence because no one else wants to see the world their way, right? Another way to look at this is your reality can be anything. Your reality can be your town that you grew up in. Your reality can be the TV you watch or the website you go to, whatever, right? And so Plato is challenging you to move out of that comfort zone into a new reality, right? Any of our international students who come and study with us here have moved out of Plato's cave into another place to experience a new reality. And so there are lots of ways we can interpret this. But the idea is, going back to the idea of the chair, what is real? What is real, right? We don't really know. Another way to explain it is geometry. We say, or Plato says, that the only things that are real are things in our mind, things that we can, that we think of, but as soon as it's a physical thing, then it can change, and therefore it changes, it's not real, okay? So geometry. You make an equation for a circle. That's the perfect circle. It's the circle that exists in your mind. It's an equation. But as soon as you take that pencil and try to draw it on a piece of graph paper, then the circle ceases to exist. It is not real. Why? Because it is a physical circle. So the only things that are real are things in our mind, things that cannot change. Okay? Hopefully that's clear as mud. Now, the idea is this. This is not practical. All right? I cannot say to Mr. Peer, our headmaster, Mr. Peer, the room is a physical space that I teach in. It's physical space. So I'm not going to show up and teach today because it's not a real room because it's physical, right? So there's no point in me showing up. If you were to say to me, I know we have a quiz today, Mr. Emmett, that quiz is going to be on a piece of physical paper, and therefore the quiz will not exist, and therefore I'm not going to take the quiz. I'll say, I'll give you a 0. You say, oh, okay, you can give me a 0, but as soon as you put the 0 in the grade book, it's a physical 0, so therefore it doesn't exist, right? That doesn't work. That's not going to make me happy or your parents happy. That doesn't pay the bills. So where does Plato fit? How does Plato help us? How does he influence Western thought if it's all this like big ideas that don't fit into the real world? The key here is not ideas, it's ideals, right? What is the difference between an idea and ideal? Well, let me explain. If I ask you to draw a tree, you could, no matter how crappy you think you are at art, you could, draw a tree, and I could look and say, oh, that's a tree. Very good. So a tree, a physical tree, you wrote it. Good. If I ask you to draw love, I would get a variety of pictures, probably a different picture from every person who drew love. Maybe a heart, maybe birds, maybe a man and a woman, maybe, anything. Love, right? And so that's harder to focus on, right? And that's what Plato's talking about. Plato's talking about those bigger ideas, not the table or the chair, but justice, truth, beauty, goodness. And the idea is we don't see those things in the physical world in their perfect form. You'll never find the perfect justice. You'll never find the perfect truth or the perfect goodness. You'll never find the perfect love. There's always going to be warts. There's always going to be something wrong with it, right? So where do these exist in the perfect form? And the idea is, you guessed it, the mind, right? There's a copy of the perfect justice in our mind. There's a copy of the perfect truth in our mind. There's a copy of the perfect goodness in our mind, right? And so as we go forth in our lives and as we live our lives, then we try to recreate the perfect ideals around us in our physical world. Will we ever make them perfect? No, we won't. It's a physical world and the world is flawed. But in trying to create the perfect world around us, we make the world better. And that's Plato's point, right? And here's how significant it is. No matter what you teach as a teacher, no matter what subject it is or where it is, that's your goal. Your goal is to instill in your students that they need to go out and they need to try to create the perfect world. It is a race that you never finish. It is a mountain that you never reach the top of. But making the world a better place is the point, right? And that's the point that Plato has. And that's why he's so significant. Take a look at this. The good are unwilling to rule, either for money's sake or for honor. So they must be forced to consent under the threat of penalty. The heaviest penalty for declining to rule is to be ruled by someone inferior to yourself. That is the fear, I believe, that makes decent people accept power, right? And so that's the idea of Plato. Good people must stand up and do things, or bad people will take over, right? And so Plato, it's a big idea, right? He's really deep and heavy. So I'm sure some of you are out there going, what the heck is he talking about? Well, let me explain to you who also said, what the heck is he talking about? And that is Aristotle. Right? Aristotle thought this was a bunch of crap. Aristotle was the student of Plato. So Socrates teaches Plato. Plato teaches Aristotle. And Aristotle's like, what do you mean the chair's not real? It's right there. It's real. I sit in it. I shake it around, right? We can't think of things as the real stuff is here and the fake stuff is here. We have to think of it as together, right? As in one form. And so Aristotle completely disagreed with Plato and wrote his own and became famous his own way, which is a form of what we call pragmatism. Okay, the idea of reality, and reality, the world we live in, is what we have to deal with, right? So he was a student of Plato. He didn't agree with the theory of forms. He was more of a pragmatist, right? He devoted his life to the study of the physical world. So natural science, he was very important to natural science and nature. He considered the father of Western philosophy. So again, a big name in the world of Western philosophy. And his ideas about natural science would influence Europe. And one of the most important things he did was teach Alexander the Great. So he was hired by Alexander's father, Philip, to go north, right, and to teach his son and all the other royal children, right? And he did. So here's why Aristotle is important. Aristotle gets a bad rap. A lot of his ideas have lately been proven to be false. And we can't blame the guy. He was living in ancient Greece, and so he was doing his best. But the theories about nature that were wrong, and the theories about the solar system that were wrong. But what he did come up with is the idea that we're all made of the same stuff, right? And he didn't call them atoms, but he meant atoms. We're all made of the same stuff, and that makes us connected. And so like the bee goes to the flower and then goes back to the hive, we are all connected by the physical natural world. We are all made of the same stuff, essentially. Now, the problem is that his ideas and other Greek philosopher ideas would be adopted by the civilization and society of the Middle Ages of Europe, and they would teach flawed science all the way up until the scientific revolution, where scientists would discover, hey, they weren't really right, and change things around. And that's why sometimes Aristotle gets a bad rap, because he got it wrong, and it stayed wrong for centuries until someone discovered that it wasn't right. But let's give the guy a break, okay? He's doing his best, and he did come up with some pretty important ideas about nature and natural science. Okay. So here's the difference, right, between Plato and Aristotle. Plato's the world of forms. This is the ideal apple. This is the apple that's in our brain. Sometimes we go to pick apples, and the apples look like this. So this apple is not real. This is the apple that's real. Well, that's silly. These apples, of course, are real. And that's what Aristotle would say. Look, we have the form, and we have matter, and we marry those things. They cannot be separated. They are the same, right? The ideal of what we see and the physical of what we see is the same, right? We have to make that compromise in our mind and do that. And so there's your a simple explanation of the difference between what Plato thought and what Aristotle thought. Again, this is much bigger than like, what's wrong with Athens? Why do we lose the war, right? We have gone far beyond this. And on a daily basis, people would come to the academy in Athens and learn from these teachers who would not just teach about how to make our city-state better, but these big ideas of truth and beauty and goodness and natural science and how the universe works and geography and things like that, right? And so we've exploded the idea of education here and really expanded it in ancient Athens. Okay, so as Athens declines, the educational center shifts, and it shifts to the new city of Alexandria. Alexandria, of course, was founded by Alexander the Great. It sits in Egypt and still is there today, and was a city of progress and science and invention and creation. It was a pretty amazing place. One of the most amazing things about Alexandria was the lighthouse. I think I got this from a video game. Video games have some great art nowadays. It's amazing. And so the lighthouse, and again, no electricity yet, they would have this huge structure here, this huge tower. At the top of the tower, they have these huge bronze discs that would rotate and reflect a fire that was lit in the middle. And so, like a lighthouse, it would just shine, so the boats would not run into the rocks or anything there, right? So that lighthouse at Alexandria was a pretty amazing thing. But for our purposes in education, that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at the library at Alexandria. And this is a sketch of what the library looked like. Contained scrolls from all over the ancient world, many of them Greek scientists and Greek mathematicians and Greek philosophers that had theories about the earth and nature and math and all this stuff. And it was all kept in the library here. That was kind of a temple/library that they would have. Sadly, the building was destroyed and burned, and so much of those books are gone. You can see it's a pretty impressive structure. Okay, so well, let's talk about science a little bit. So a lot of these people that we're going to talk about studied at the academy, sometimes even under Plato and Aristotle, and then went on to teach others and write books about their field of study. Let's talk about astronomy. One of the most important Greek astronomers that we study is a guy named Aristarchus. And Aristarchus of Samos was important because he's the first one who theorized that the sun was larger than the earth, and that the earth actually revolved around the sun. Right? And so he was the first one. Now, his ideas were not very popular. People wondered, how could the earth be moving? It's a stationary place. I mean, if I'm on a ship and like someone drops, or if I'm walking, like why aren't things flying at me? Because the earth is like, moving. Nothing's moving here. I'm just standing still. No one understood that the earth was so big that you couldn't feel it move. So eventually his ideas were kind of forgotten. And another scientist named Ptolemy came along. Ptolemy was a great scientist, but he did theorize that the Earth was the center of the universe. It's what we will call in the scientific revolution a geocentric universe, a Ptolemaic universe. So the Earth is there, and everything revolves around the Earth. The sun and the planets and everything just kind of revolves around the Earth. And that became the law of nature for the next 14 centuries until the scientific revolution changes it, right? We'll talk about that. Another great astronomer and mathematician of this period is Eratosthenes. And Eratosthenes was the first one to calculate the size of the Earth. And he was very close to the actual size, right? So using math, using observation, using all of those things, they're able to create facts and proofs of science. Okay, Aristarchus of Samos. Dang, I told y'all. That's what he's going to say in the scientific revolution. See? The sun is the center of the universe. You tell him, Aristarchus. All right, so mathematics and physics. Euclid, again, if you take geometry, Euclid is a name that you know. He opened a school of geometry in Alexandria. He wrote a book, The Elements, with 465 geometric proofs, right? And so the idea of mathematics and geometry was created by Euclid. Archimedes is going to be very famous. He actually lived in Syracuse, which is on the Italian peninsula, and so he estimated the value of pi. He did many things. He was an inventor and a mathematician, so he estimated the value of pi. He created the lever. Give me a lever long enough and I'll move the world, is his famous quote, right? And so there's stories about him, and he created a pulley system that could pull things. One story talks about how these men course, Syracuse was on the ocean, and these men were trying to pull in the ship, and it was really heavy, and he's like, I can do this. So he hooked up a pulley system, and he pulled the ship with just his two hands, all the way up to the dock, right? And so he knew weight. He created one of the first catapults. And you read about Archimedes, there are tons of stuff that he did, but he was a very famous Greek inventor and mathematician, lived in Italy. Pythagoras, again, we know the Pythagorean theorem. He did develop this theorem, but it's one of these situations in history where he discovered it, but he didn't discover it first. The Chinese actually had it before. And so we have Chinese examples of the Pythagorean theorem, and then we have Pythagoras' example. And so it was the discovering of angles of different triangles, right? You probably are more familiar with that than I am. I teach history. So here we are, Pythagorean theorem. But again, we have ancient scrolls of Chinese writing that they figured this out as well, and a little before Pythagoras. Okay, so later philosophy. So we talked about Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. In later years, we have a philosopher named Zeno. And Zeno founded the type of philosophy known as Stoicism. This is going to be very popular in the Roman Empire. The most famous Stoic that we read about in the Roman Empire is the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who becomes a Stoic by the end of his life. What Stoics believe is that the universe is controlled by divine power. So your goal as a human is to live virtuously, right? According to natural law. Human desires are dangerous. You're not to give in to vices and the desires of the flesh. You must be above that, right? And you should promote social unity and encourage people to focus on and live with things they could control, right? And so what makes Marcus Aurelius such a famous Stoic is that he spent his life conquering territory and, enslaving, people from other parts. And then by the end of his life, he's like, that's not really what a Stoic does. He wrote books about Stoicism. He was a very serious Stoic, right? But again, change the things you can. Don't worry about the things you can't change. Be a good person. That's kind of what Stoicism teaches, right? Another type of philosophy is known by Epicurus, and it's Epicureanism. And this is interesting. The universe is made up of atoms and ruled by gods who have no concern for people. And so the gods don't affect your life, and you don't affect their life, so there's no point in praying to the gods. So what's the point of life? Well, the point of life is to pursue human pleasures and harmonize the body with the mind. And so Epicureanism today can kind of has the idea of if it feels good, do it. Just do it. There's no morality out there or ethics that you have to worry about. No punishment from the gods because they don't care. Just do your thing. It's your world. You're living in it. And so that's a little corrupt. I mean, it wasn't that amoral, but that's kind of what Epicurean is today. So we have this Epicureans. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. But that's what we think of Epicureanism today. That's not really what it is. It was more laid back than that. But it was focused on the idea of just do your thing, All right, so Hellenistic art. And one of the things that we didn't get a chance to talk about is the idea of drama in plays. We did talk about the human form. But the one thing just to know is that like Socrates and other philosophers that criticized the Greek world and the Athenian government, playwrights did that as well. There was lots of what we call satire, which is making fun of a serious situation. And a lot of Greek plays wrote satire about the government and about society and things like that. And satire is going to be a very important form of literature that helps criticize different institutions and moves the story of history along, right? One example of satire in ancient Greece is the Frogs. And the Frogs was written by, I'm going to think of it in a second anyway, but it was this play about these frogs that sit around a pond and they just chirp at each other. And they say that the chirping, and this is how the Greeks, their chirping was kaxi, 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 right? And that's all they said to each other. And so this was the Athenian government. They're just a bunch of frogs chirping at each other, but they don't get anything done. So the idea of satire was very important in plays. Now, Hellenism in art, as we talked about, is motion and emotion. And a couple of examples of Hellenism that moves out of Greece with Alexander and other influences and moves into other areas is Nike of Samothrace. Again, it's not Athenian, it's from Samothrace. And we talked about this with the human form. One of the things we didn't talk about is a statue that doesn't exist anymore, and that is the Colossus of Rhodes, right? And the Colossus of Rhodes is this huge, almost Statue of Liberty type statue that sat over the harbor in Rhodes. And what you did was you sailed through his legs to get to the harbor and out again. And it had a light at the top. It was made of bronze, and it sat there for a long time until eventually there was an earthquake and it fell, right? And so examples of Greek, so we have Greek education and philosophy that moves out to Egypt and other places, and Greek art that will also move out as well. And, of course, the greatest Hellenistic society that we think of is Rome. And we'll talk about Rome in a little bit. So that's it. And so that's kind of the idea of philosophy and science, just a kind of a brief view of the major figures in Greek philosophy and science that helped influence Western civilization. So stay tuned for other videos, especially about Rome, maybe a little one on Christianity. So stay tuned. See ya.